Go ahead.
Brethren, greetings again. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. I can see there's a number of brethren who have posted messages on the chat group from India, Argentina, Australia, South Africa, Poland. So welcome to you all. It's our 12th talk today. Very excited about this one. As always, I shall start with some housekeeping. The meeting will be, as you know, recorded and posted to both our Facebook and YouTube page. Therefore, for those of you who do not wish to be seen, please feel free to turn your videos off. Brethren, over the past couple of weeks, we have witnessed a lot of background noise during the talks. As you can imagine, it is quite a challenge to keep up with all the attendees all of the time. Therefore, if you could please be mindful to keep your microphones on mute, that would really be appreciated. There will, of course, be a Q&A session after the talk. The usual rules will apply. If you would like to ask a question, please use the hand up icon on Zoom. Wait for your name to be called out, then unmute yourself, ask your question, and then please don't forget to put yourself on mute. And please don't mind me saying this, brethren, but to ensure that the session runs smoothly and to give everyone a chance, may I ask that you kindly keep to asking one question and avoid making any statements. Thank you. We are, of course, giving away 2 of our bespoke Freemasons Without Borders mugs. It wouldn't be one of our calls if we weren't. For a chance of winning, please answer the following question. How many languages does Tony speak? Please type your answers in the chat section, and as always, the first 2 correct answers will win. Brethren, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you very worshipful brother, Tony Harvey. Tony began his Masonic journey in 1991 and joined a scouting lodge, namely Pioneer Lodge, number 9065 in Derbyshire, where he was initiated, passed and raised. In the craft, Tony was Derbyshire's first provincial Grand Mentor from 2009 to 2013, and he is currently Head of Learning and Development in the province of West Kent. He holds the rank of Past Provincial Senior Grand Warden in Derbyshire and Past Provincial Junior Grand Warden in Nottinghamshire. The United Grand Lodge of England appointed Tony as the 2012 Prestonian Lecturer, and in 2016 he was appointed to the grand rank of Past Assistant Grand Director of Ceremonies. Tony was exalted into the Royal Arch in Pioneer Chapter 9065 in 1994. He has been First Principal of 2 chapters, Pioneer number 9065 and Authors 3456. He is a Past Provincial Grand Registrar in Derbyshire and was appointed a Past Grand Director of Ceremonies in Supreme Grand Chapter in April 2020. Tony was then advanced into Derby Lodge of Mark Master Masons number 302 in 1995. He was Provincial Grand Secretary for Derbyshire from 2007 to 2015 and is currently the Secretary of the Mark Provincial Grand Secretaries Lodge number 1641. Tony is a past Grand Junior Overseer in the Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons and a holder of Royal Ark Mariner Grand Rank and a past Provincial Grand Senior Warden in the Mark Province of London, and has attained the honourable rank of Very Worshipful Brother. Professionally, Tony is a leadership and management consultant and has managed his own practice for the last 25 years. He is an author, writer, speaker and trainer, and has published books and articles in the areas of learning, training and organisational development. He is a freeman of the City of London and a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Educators. In his spare time, Tony enjoys walking, driving fast cars, with the hood down I'm led to believe, and being a lifelong scout. He is also a loving husband and a proud father. Brethren, the information I've alluded to is but a snippet of the achievements in Tony's professional, Masonic and personal life. Very worshipful brother Tony Harvey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Amit, and thank you, brethren, for coming along for this particular lecture. I'm delighted to be giving this particular talk, and I'm looking forward very much to the Q&A at the end. So, as a regular contributor to the growing number of Masonic Facebook groups, I'm astounded by the widespread misunderstanding about the links between the principal degrees in Freemasonry, which are the subject of this talk. It seems to me that we continue to confuse the history of the degrees with the narrative and symbolic links between them. This particular talk was inspired by a 2004 paper entitled "The Relevance of Mark and Royal Arch Degrees to the Craft" by Worshipful Brother T.T. Kuravila of the Grand Lodge of India, and I acknowledge his insight. My own talk on the same theme is based on the relationship in the English Constitution and my own original research. In it, I seek to resolve the confusion and provide a useful basis for cooperation between adherents of these degrees. So in this first part, which you're going to hear today, I examine the historical links, but perhaps you might consider inviting me back to part 2 if you wish to learn of the narrative and symbolic links. The relationship between the craft, the mark and the Royal Arch in England and Wales at least hinges on the Act of Union of 1813, the instrument that formed the United Grand Lodge of England. The first sentence of the second article states, "It is declared and pronounced that pure ancient masonry consists of 3 degrees and no more, those of the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, and the master mason, including the supreme order of the Holy Royal Arch." Now, the first thing to note is that the mark is not mentioned here, and I shall return to that point shortly. The second is that for many years, this declaration was interpreted to mean that the Royal Arch is part of the craft. Indeed, for many years, the Royal Arch was described as the completion of the Master Mason's degree. Yet both have all the well-known features of a complete degree structure, including the admission, blessing, proving or testing, the obligation, entrusting.
May I please stop you for a second? Is it just me? The line is breaking up. I don't have audio.
Let me just check that.
I'm hearing shock from the UK, and I'm hearing your audio fine.
Yeah, it's all coming through fine.
Problem. Mine's fine as well. Is it fine with you all? Okay.
All good. Okay.
That's good.
Amit, do you want me to continue?
Yes, please.
Yes, please, Tony.
Sorry, could I just make a suggestion that if people
No problem.
their videos, it saves bandwidth on the link, and they may get a better download of your voice.
Fortunately, we won't see the PowerPoint pictures either then.
No, I don't think there's a problem at my end. I think there's a problem elsewhere. I have a very, very fast connection here.
No, it's coming through fine, Tony. I think if we just, if you
Yeah,
could.
it's fine here too.
It would help me if
fine
other people were to mute their microphones as well.
Everyone moots.
Thank you, brethren. I shall continue. So both the Master Mason's degree and the Royal Arch have all the well-known features of a complete degree structure, including the admission, blessing, proving or testing, the obligation, entrusting with secrets, an explanation of the traditional history of the degree and moral lessons, and of course the investiture of the new entrant. So what more can you possibly expect from any degree ceremony? In fact, any suggestion that the third degree is not a complete degree is clearly wrong and potentially frustrating to the newly raised brother, who would be justified in feeling cheated, or worse still, feeling that he's an inferior or incomplete Freemason. The ambiguous wording of this second article has created confusion and misunderstanding for over 200 years. As early as 1843, the editor of the Freemasons' Quarterly Review suggested the entire system requires careful examination. In 2003, United Grand Lodge and Supreme Grand Chapter did just that. And since then, they no longer describe the Royal Arch as the completion of the third degree, and reference to it being so was removed from the ritual in 2004. Today, United Grand Lodge of England and Supreme Grand Chapter consider the two orders of the craft and the Royal Arch to be the two parts of an umbrella entity unique in our constitution called pure ancient masonry. And we now describe the Royal Arch as the completion of the journey that began with initiation. Now, this position is fully supported by a close examination of the physical act of union. It's clear that key parts of the sentence that I've quoted have been amended. Now, I've adjusted the contrast in the slide and indicated the altered words. In his Royal Arch Batham lecture, Douglas Burford suggested that the document, when signed, would originally have read, "It is declared and pronounced that pure ancient masonry consists of 4 degrees and no more, viz. Those of the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, the master mason, and also the supreme degree of the Holy Royal Arch." The version that has come down to us has created confusion, but the original was unacceptable to the moderns, and I'll return to this point also. By creating an entity called Pure Ancient Masonry, the Act of Union established an indissoluble link between the craft and the Royal Arch in the English Constitution. And from this stems the intertwined governance of the two. The craft degrees, of course, are conferred in lodges under warrants issued by the United Grand Lodge of England, and the Royal Arch is conferred in Royal Arch chapters under charters issued by the Supreme Grand Chapter of England. Chapters are separate membership units, but each is attached to a craft lodge and carries its number. The Grand Master is always the first Grand Principal, if qualified to be so, and the Grand Secretary is also the Grand Scribee, again, if so qualified. Members of the Craft Board of General Purposes serve on the Royal Arch's Committee of General Purposes and vice versa. Effectively, United Grand Lodge and Supreme Grand Chapter are interlinked, and I like to think of them as the two sides of one coin. So what of the mark? It is not included in this system of pure ancient masonry. In the English Constitution, it is conferred in mark lodges under warrants issued by the independent and sovereign Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons. But the situation is different in Scotland and in Ireland. In both cases, the mark is a qualifying degree that has to be taken before the Royal Arch, and in both cases, it can only be conferred on Master Masons. There is no indissoluble link between the Craft and Royal Arch in Scotland or Ireland, and their Supreme Grand Chapters are quite separate, independent bodies. In both constitutions, the Supreme Grand Chapter governs the mark. In Scotland, their Supreme Grand Chapter permits the mark to be taken in either craft lodges or Royal Arch chapters. But in Ireland, it has to be taken in a mark lodge, which is attached to a Royal Arch chapter. Now, some brethren have suggested that the situation in England and Wales really ought to have followed the Scottish or Irish pattern. But what they may not understand is that the Scottish and Irish Supreme Grand Chapters were not formed and had not taken the mark under their wings until after the Union of 1813. The Scottish Grand Chapter was formed in 1817, and it was only in the 1830s that they considered the mark to be an essential prerequisite for the Royal Arch. The Irish Grand Chapter was formed in 1829, but it was not until 1931 that the Irish Grand Lodge recognised the mark and the Royal Arch. So are you confused? Perhaps I need to explain how what we have now came about. And of course, it was through quirks of history rather than design. So let's go back to the early years of organised Freemasonry, shortly after the foundation of the Premier Grand Lodge in 1717. At that time, there were only the first and second degrees of craft masonry. The Master Mason's degree did not exist until the 1720s, and it appears then to have been a new invention with no elements from operative practice. It includes traces of Elizabethan literature and a reworking of parts of the story of Noah into the building of King Solomon's Temple. It was created perhaps to satisfy the expectations and aspirations of new members, including the educated and professional classes, as well as the aristocracy, who were then being introduced into the new speculative lodges. Perhaps the second Duke of Montague and others were not satisfied to be simply fellows of the craft. The third degree also injected a higher level of morality, consistent with Enlightenment thinking. The first reference to a Royal Arch came in Ireland more than 20 years later, but the records do not confirm that any degree ceremony had been worked. Lawrence Dermot stated that he was made a Royal Arch Mason in Dublin in 1746, and in 1749 the Grand Lodge of Ireland issued warrants establishing 2 Royal Arch lodges. The earliest record of a Royal Arch degree ceremony in England features Thomas Dunkley, who was made a Royal Arch Mason in Portsmouth in 1754, 30 years after the Master Mason's degree emerged. If the Master Mason's degree had been intended and designed to be incomplete, an early Master Mason would have had to wait at least 30 years for the concluding part. And that strikes me as absurd. If the Royal Arch was not devised to be the completion of the Master Mason's degree, then why was it created? Although the degree ceremony itself came around 30 years after the Master Masons, elements of the Royal Arch are certainly much older. These elements, including the wearing of robes and the carrying of rods, staffs or sceptres, relate to the true Master Masons of operative Freemasonry. In medieval times, the lodge was for the working Mason. The medieval Master Mason was a member of the higher status local guild rather than the lodge. He was a professional, not a craftsman, a highly skilled architect, a draftsman and clerk of works, all in one. The Royal Arch was originally restricted to past masters of the craft. Is it possible that the Royal Arch was developed as a Masonic version of the admission of the true Master Mason, the higher status architect, into a guild? Is that why companions meet in chapters, the word which is used to describe the ruling assembly of a cathedral, rather than in a lodge? Another possibility is that the Royal Arch was devised to provide the allegorical basis for the discovery of our spiritual relationship with our Creator, a theme which I pick up in my talk, What is Freemasonry's Fascination with Completion? If we turn to the mark, the first part of this reflects old operative practices that date back at least as far as the organisation of Scottish lodges, introduced by the Shaw Statutes in 1598. Now, some very early speculative lodges worked ceremonies that included elements of these practices, but again, that does not imply a degree was conferred. And the first record of a mark ceremony being worked in England dates to 1769, when the very same Thomas Dunkley conferred the degrees of Mark Man and Mark Master on 3 Royal Arch companions. So, over a 50-year period after the formation of the Premier Grand Lodge, between 1720 and 1769, there developed what have since become the major elements of today's speculative Freemasonry. These were the Master Mason's degree, the installation ceremony, which I don't touch on any further in this talk at least, the mark and the Royal Arch degrees. These new degrees and ceremonies built on fragments of operative practices, but also drew on stories, symbolism, and philosophies that were not previously present in Masonic ceremonies. However, the status of these degrees was controversial. Traditionalists had objected to the way in which the Premier Grand Lodge had made alterations and innovations to Freemasonry. So in 1751, representatives of 6 London lodges met and formed a rival Grand Lodge. Their Grand Secretary, Lawrence Dermot, nicknamed this Grand Lodge the Ancients, implying that it practiced Freemasonry in its original form. From then on, the Premier Grand Lodge was known colloquially as the Moderns, and the 2 Grand Lodges developed very different views on the status of the Mark and the Royal Arch. The Ancients Grand Lodge considered both to be parts of ancient Freemasonry, and they authorised their subordinate craft lodges to confer both degrees. The Premier Grand Lodge, or Moderns, wanted only the 3 craft degrees to be conferred in its lodges. Nevertheless, many of its lodges conducted Royal Arch ceremonies, and some also conducted the mark. Eventually, in 1766, some modern Freemasons, led by the Grand Master Lord Blaney, signed the Charter of Compact to form the excellent Grand and Royal Arch chapter of the Royal Arch of Jerusalem, in order to recognise and regulate the Royal Arch quite separate from their craft Grand Lodge. By the end of the 18th century, despite the disputes between the rival Grand Lodges, the craft, mark and Royal Arch were all part of one common system. The narratives of the degrees had become interlinked, and there were also many thematic and symbolic connections between them. And perhaps one reason for this is that at the centre of their development and promotion was one man, Thomas Dunkley. Dunkley refined the ritual of the third degree and that of the Royal Arch, and he also championed and enhanced the mark. Since the 18th century, however, there have been many changes to our rituals, our ceremonies, and of course our governance. And the effect has been to take elements out of this one common system, resulting in holes and gaps that have since been filled, I believe, by misunderstanding and confusion. At the Union of 1813, when the ancients and moderns came together to form the United Grand Lodge of England, a compromise had to be found, and it had to accommodate the two Grand Lodges, neither of whom could be seen to lose face. To satisfy the moderns, reference had to be made to 3 degrees and no more. And the Royal Arch, if included at all, had to be conferred separately from lodges. However, to satisfy the ancients, there was no if. The Royal Arch had to be included. So the wording of the declaration that has come down to us, amended as Burford tells us, was, to put it bluntly, a fudge. And that's a past Grand Secretary's word, not mine. Sorry, could the others please switch off their microphones? Thank you. That fudge led to the suggestion that the Royal Arch was the concluding part of an unfinished Master Mason's degree. No other jurisdiction has made this claim. And as we have seen in England and Wales, we now consider the Craft and Royal Arch as the 2 component parts of a third entity, pure ancient Masonry. So how might the declaration be worded if it was drafted using today's punctuation and without the sensitivities that divided the ancients and the moderns? This is just one attempt. It is declared and pronounced that pure ancient Masonry consists of the 3 degrees of the craft, namely entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, which are governed by United Grand Lodge of England, and that of the Holy Royal Arch, governed by Supreme Grand Chapter. 4 years after the union of the craft Grand Lodges, the Royal Arch was put under the jurisdiction of a new governing body. Although separate, this Supreme Grand Chapter was and remains led by the same principal officers who govern the United Grand Lodge. And in addition, it was arranged that chapters should be attached to lodges and carry the same number. So what happened to the mark? At the union of the ancients and moderns, it was omitted from this new system, although many lodges in England and Wales continue to work to the degree. Perhaps to include it was simply pushing the compromise too far. But this situation could not continue for long. After a Scottish Royal Arch chapter started issuing warrants for English mark lodges, all agreed that a means had to be found to regularise the mark. In 1856, a new Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons was formed to govern the degree, after consideration was first given to incorporating the mark into the craft. And since then, in England and Wales, the mark and the Royal Arch have been separate and distinct, each with their own governing bodies. However, despite being governed separately, because the craft, the mark and the Royal Arch had evolved around the same time and as part of one system, each degree now contains fragments of one story and symbolism. It is as if we have broken up a jigsaw. Unfortunately, some brethren now appear to confuse the allegorical stories and its symbols with the real history. Some even use aspects of that story to justify their particular position or opinion. But remember, brethren, the ritual is like a film script. It tells a fictional story. And film scripts do not always tell that story chronologically. It does not matter whether we take degrees in the sequence of the story told in their traditional histories. What matters is the purpose behind the story and our individual journey of enlightenment. The purpose of our ritual is to convey a deeper meaning using symbols and allegory. And it's from exploring that deeper meaning that we learn to become better people. Now, in part 2 of this talk, I explore the narrative and symbolic links between these principal degrees. And in particular, I focus on how the story of the craft degrees is continued in both the Mark and the Royal Arch to its conclusion. And I also look at the role of the keystone, an item alluded to in the craft, but which does not appear in any of its ritual or symbols. So for now, I'll conclude by saying that it's only when you piece together the craft, the Mark, and the Royal Arch that you realize that they are indeed all part of the one same system, and that all of them are important for a fuller understanding of that system. There, I hope that stimulates your Masonic curiosity. So brethren, thank you for your attention and interest. I'm now very happy to receive questions, and I shall do my very best to attempt to answer them. Over to you.
If you could please use the hand up icon. Tony, thank you so much. Kind of whets the appetite to want to know more, to be honest with you.
Good.
Superb talk. Thank you very, very much. Let's have a look, see who we've got on.
Don't tell me I've answered everything people might want to know.
We'll give them a moment to put on the icon there, Tony.
I mean, can you see the hands up icons?
I can't see any at the moment. No, can you?
Oh, you can't see it. Okay. Colin Jackson goes first.
My hands is up. My
Okay.
hands is up.
Johnny, just hold on.
One
Colin
moment.
Jackson, please.
If we could go to Colin Jackson first, please.
Thank you very much. Tony, as always, a fantastic lecture, which very clearly links those 3 elements. However, to what extent would you agree that even those 3 elements do not tell the story unless you... Oh, strange noise in the background. That those 3 elements do not tell the whole story unless you also include those degrees that are in Royal and Select Masters?
Well, it depends what you mean by the story. The degrees of the Royal and Select Masters, for those who are not part of that order, if you like, fill in at least part of the gaps between the end of the 3rd degree and the story of the Holy Royal Arch. But many aspects of those stories weren't, of course, written until the 19th century. I acknowledge that there were elements and components that came from earlier. So I acknowledge the important part or important place that the 4 degrees that make up the Order of the Royal and Select Masters play in our understanding, if you like, of the narrative. And indeed, you know, there's many great moral stories to be gained from the order. But I wouldn't consider them to be quite as fundamental as the Master Mason's degree, the Mark, and the Royal Arch, which originated far earlier, and they developed together, as I've indicated, around the same time. They had the handprint of Thomas Dunkley on them, who had an important role in developing the ritual for all 3. So I think the Royal and Select are very important. I enjoy my membership of the Royal and Select. I find it has great meaning, but I don't think they're quite as fundamental as the craft, as the Master Mason's degrees, the Mark and the Royal Arch. I'm not in any way seeking to diminish them, Colin. I'm simply saying that they don't have the same status in my book, but they are very useful to help people to fill in the story between that 470 years that exists between the completion of King Solomon's Temple and the story of the Holy Royal Arch. So thank you for the question, Colin.
Thank you, Colin. Could we please next go to Mark Phillips?
Yes, Tony. Again, thank you for your presentation. The question that I have may be a little specific, but as far as the Master degree in the Holy Royal Arch, given the structure of the unification of United Grand Lodge of England in 1813, how did this all affect lodges in the States, more specifically in the Grand Lodge of Virginia, where the oldest Royal Arch chapter is found?
Well, Mark, what a fantastic question. I have to say, you probably know a lot more about the history of the development of the degrees on your side of the Atlantic than I do. I regret, other than having visited a lodge in your jurisdiction, I wouldn't claim to be an historian from then. I'd have to sort of find out a lot more before I could really give a very good answer to that. What I do know from a historical point of view is this: we need to look at history from the point of view of a timeline and track events in parallel with that timeline as that timeline progresses. All too often, and we see examples of this all around us, not only now but in the past, all too often people look at history through the wrong end of the telescope and they try to infer things. So an example of that would be the suggestion that many people come up with: why don't we in England and Wales do what they do in Scotland? Well, what they do in Scotland, they didn't do until long after we started doing what we do in England and Wales. So if it's only when you look at history from the point of view of the events and you move forward, you know, instead of doing rewind, you actually go forward step by step, that you look at it. And that's what I would suggest we do. I really can't give an answer based on any knowledge or evidence, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Mark. Next, could we have Andrew Armbrister, please?
Thanks, Emmett. Just unmuting. Tony, again, thanks for a great presentation. I've got a couple of questions, if I may. From your research and going through the original papers, do you see any explanation of why the two Grand Lodges took their respective positions?
That's very interesting. I think I think a lot of it comes down to the positions of key people, and you know, I only briefly mentioned him in this talk, but he deserves a lot of study in his own right, and that's Lawrence Dermot. Lawrence Dermot was a very, very strong character who had a key role in setting up the ancients. He wasn't their first Grand Secretary, but he really took them forward and shaped a lot of their positions, and of course didn't get on particularly well with Thomas Dunkley, who was a Moderns Mason. And I think there was clearly some elements of personal animosity involved. I find it very interesting that the Moderns were appear to me to have been rather more flexible, in the sense that although they didn't consider the Royal Arch to be part of the craft, they were perfectly happy to confer the Royal Arch ceremony of exaltation, the Royal Arch degree as it should be considered, and indeed the two Mark degrees, but they didn't consider it to be a fundamental part of the craft. So there was a fair degree of flexibility on the part of most moderns, and in fact, you know, the reason that the ancients considered that the moderns had interfered with a genuine Freemasonry was because the moderns had switched the signs in the first and second degree as a result of Samuel Pritchard's exposure of Freemasonry. So a lot of the resistance, a lot of the hard position, I think, tended to come from the ancients. Much more than that, I could probably not go into without sort of, you know, going back to primary sources and reading again some of the comments and some of the a lot of it exists in minutes. Yeah. From the time.
So my other question.
Are we allowed to?
Tony, yeah, my other question then went on to Thomas Dunkley, and
yes,
you ascribe a lot of praise on him, and probably rightly so. But I'm fascinated. You know, the more I go to morning prayer and we have Old Testament readings, the more you fall over pieces of Masonic story in all sorts of books, not just the ones that we started to learn, you know, most obviously King's or whatever. Do you think it's Dunkley that had the theological background, or was it other people that were able to do that?
Well, Dunkley was a sailor. I mean, you know, now's not the time to go into Dunkley's past. Many of you will know that it's suggested that Dunkley was the illegitimate son of the Prince of Wales, and he went to sea, and he had a third of his life he spent at sea, and it was when he returned from sea that he suddenly his Masonic life suddenly took off and was very much accelerated. You're right to pick up. I have a lot of admiration for Dunkley, and I think he clearly was behind the development of these or the enhancement of these degrees. I'm not too clear on his theological knowledge or his connection with the church. It might be interesting to have a look at Susan Sumner's book on him and to look into that. I personally want to do more research into Dunkley's work on the ritual itself, because I want to see if I can adopt the approach I mentioned a minute ago, and that's to look at the timeline, to look at key events, and to try to correlate key events to see at what time was he working on different aspects of different ritual, and what time did he introduce different orders, and at what degrees rather, and at what points was he involved with, for example, Bristol. So I'm planning to undertake a lot more in-depth research into Dunkley, and I can certainly look into that issue. But I couldn't tell you too much more now. But it might be worth looking at Susan Sumner's work on that area on Dunkley.
Lovely, thank you, Andrew.
Andrew.
Could we go to Grand Sumus Ian Currans, please?
Thank you, Tony. Fascinating talk as always.
Thank you, Ian.
Just one question. You referred to, in terms of the third degree allusion to Noah, the Noah. I've never seen that. Can you explain that for me?
Yes, in the biblical stories of Noah refer to an occasion when his sons attempted to. He was drunk, and he'd passed out drunk, and his sons attempted to raise him, and parts of his flesh came away, and the suggestion was that Desaguliers and others who worked on the development of the third degree had been inspired by this story of raising, and reworked it into the story of Hiram Abiff.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you.
That's the theory. But again, you see, it's like, as I say, if you've got to look at things from a timeline perspective. So, you know, it would be good to go back and see if we could find Desaguliers' notes, for example. You know, that would be fantastic, wouldn't it? To find Desaguliers' notes on you know, his draft on the third degree.
Yes. Yeah.
So yes, but it's there's, you know, a number of people who believe quite strongly that Noah was the inspiration for that part of the story of the third degree.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Interesting.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Could we go next to Blake Leach, please?
Hi, Tony. Thanks for that. That was very illuminating, and I've now got a real appreciation for looking very closely at documents and seeing if words have been changed. I just thought of several questions then we were talking about Dunkley, but I'll stick with my original, which is a follow-on from what Ian just asked. When you said about the allusions in the Master Mason degree to the keystone, I was wondering what you meant there. I was racking my brain trying to think of anything there that might be similar to the mark in our normal third degree. Just wondering what you were referring to there.
Okay, well, there's no reference to the keystone in the craft. And in fact, even if you look at the third degree tracing board, and if you zoom right in, you can't actually see a keystone, but you do hear reference to the porchway in the third degree. And there is another allusion to the keystone, or rather to an arch. The only time an arch appears in the craft is in the Grand or Royal sign. And the Grand or Royal sign, or rather an arch, seems to me to be used at times when either we're in a place of great esteem or holiness, or in the presence of a person of great esteem, such as a high ruler. So the arch seems to be, and of course in King Solomon's temple, the arch is above, and this comes from the mark, of course, is above the holiest place in the temple. And it's the final part. I mean, I'll make another point, a sort of segue from what you're saying into this point. I hear a lot of people say that the mark is the conclusion or the completion of the second degree. Well, it's preposterous. The second degree doesn't conclude with people getting their wages. So I acknowledge that the mark man is, if you like, much more closely related to the fellowcraft degree. I wouldn't say that the degree is incomplete without it, but I would say that the degree of mark man at the point at which we are awarded our individual mark is much more linked and much more appropriate for fellowcrafts. But the events described in the degree of Mark Master Mason take place almost exactly at the same time, certainly in the same week as the events described in the Master Mason's degree. The degree of Mark Master Mason is much more closely linked to the degree of Master Mason. And bear in mind that it's not until the degree of Mark Master Mason that King Solomon's temple is completed. So this whole issue of completion is something that I pick up in another talk that I'm writing at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to that one then.
Thanks. Could we next go to, I don't have a surname, Stephen, I believe, with the background of a goose and a cat.
Evening, apologies, yes, Stephen Hines.
Hello, Stephen.
Thank you for a very good discourse on the links historically. I was just wondering where we've got the very clear links between the Royal Arch and craft. How does Mark appear to be getting left behind at the moment?
Well, I don't know whether it is. The mark is doing very well. But what we have to remember is that the craft and the Royal Arch are part of one organisation and the mark is part of another. So I don't really know what you mean by left behind.
And I'm thinking the very clear almost persuasion of people to move into the Royal Arch, having completed their third degree, but actually there seems to be very little encouragement, certainly where I am at the moment, to join Mark.
To join
Mark.
Okay, so the craft and the Royal Arch, as I have explained, are part of the same organisation. And if you're an officer or a member of that, a member of that organisation, then you clearly would be promoting your organisation. The mark is part of a separate and sovereign body under the Grand Lodge of Mark Master Mason. It is a separate organisation. Whilst they're both part of Freemasonry, they are separate organisations. So why would? I'm being, I'm being provocative here, perhaps. But if your focus is on a particular organisation, then surely you would promote that organisation before you promote another organisation. So think of the craft and the Royal Arch as the two elements that together make up one entity called Pure Ancient Masonry. Think of them as the two sides of the same coin. Having completed that Pure Ancient Masonry, then of course joining other orders is all well and good. But I fully understand why the craft would want people to complete the components that fall under there before going on to something else. But my answer is based upon the idea of separate organisations rather than chronology of the story.
Wonderful, thank you. You filled a hole in my knowledge.
Thanks, Stephen. Brethren, before we go to our next question, could I ask you to please remember to put the mics on mute? I will do it.
Reception.
Right, that's better. Tony, you might need to unmute yourself again. Could we please go next to, I believe it's his birthday today, actually, Matthew Christmas. Happy birthday, Matthew.
Thank you. I didn't know anyone knew. Thank you. I don't want to be controversial, Tony, because you know me, that's not my way. But surely your answer to Steve was a political answer. And obviously you're a Grand Officer in all three. Surely if we're talking about it ritualistically, the extreme encouragement, let's put it like that, for people to join the chapter, which I personally love, puts lots of people off because they don't see how they have moved from the third degree to the Holy Royal Arch. Wouldn't it be better if we were able to reinvent things ritualistically and for the retention of Freemasons to incorporate some of these organizations together? I realize that's a controversial idea. I'm not saying do it like America or wherever. I'm just suggesting that you are having to very carefully explain a very arcane and utterly artificial organizational difference. And when we talk about pure and ancient Freemasonry, that is a complete political fudge. And do you not think we should stop doing that and actually be honest about what Freemasonry, the Freemasonic journey is?
Okay, so Matthew, happy birthday. First of all, I don't think I'm giving a political answer. I'm giving an answer based upon the historic and constitutional situation. And in fact, I'm in this talk not addressing the story so much in the ritual or its progression, although I do say that it is not necessary for a story to progress chronologically. You know, many very well-known films actually use flashback. So I don't think the argument that we should experience the degrees chronologically, I don't think that's a particularly tight argument. I don't consider my earlier answer to Stephen to be political. I'm simply explaining, and bear in mind I work as a consultant in organisations. I'm simply explaining that they are separate organisations, and therefore there is a focus on the promoting what is best in the best interests of your organisation. I think the other dimension to this is looking at things from the point of view of the individual and their individual journey. And this is where I think we sometimes lose sight of what things should be. As somebody involved in mentoring and very much promoting the concepts behind and the practice of mentoring, I want to see us explaining to people what their Masonic journey is and helping them make sense of it in a way that is useful to them. And therefore, I believe that it is our obligation, our duty, to explain to people the different degrees and the different options that are available to them following the third degree, and so that they've got the facts and can make the right decision, the decision that's best for them. I don't believe that we should be promoting or encouraging a division or dissension or competition between those various degrees. I do not think it is healthy for Freemasonry for us to be getting into a discussion as to which one somebody should join before the other. I think, we know the craft's position on this. That's been made absolutely clear. The Grand Master, in his position as First Grand Principal, made a statement last year in Supreme Grand Chapter on his position, and that was based upon the premise that the craft and the Royal Arch are part of the same organisation. But when it comes down to individuals, we as mentors discuss what is right for individuals. And so various different versions of that discussion can can take place. Whether or not it is appropriate, necessary to, if you like, unravel 200 years of history. Remember what I said, the editor of the Freemasons Quarterly Review in 1843 suggested it was a bowl of spaghetti, effectively. And yes, there is a part of me which would love to see some of that being unraveled and straightened out. And, you know, who knows, that may well come. Personally, I think that we've got far bigger challenges in Freemasonry at the moment. And our time and our energy should be spent developing our membership, consolidating our membership, growing our membership in our lodges. And I think our time and attention ought to go into those things. And quite frankly, the Mark and other orders progress and succeed on their own merit, and they're succeeding very, very well indeed. As you know, and the number of people joining the Royal Arch is going up, or the percentage rather of craft masons who join the Royal Arch is going up. The Mark is working very hard on membership development, and I'm involved in that. So I promote both orders. I don't see either of them as competing with the other, and I don't think it's necessary at this point. I don't think it's the best use of our time at this point to try to unravel them. Whether that happens in the future or not, I don't know. So Matthew, I've tried to give a range of different answers there, and I've tried to explain, in a sense, why some people get very focused on the Royal Arch next. What I can't do is account for your local experience and how within the jurisdiction you're part of, or the province or district that you're part of, how that is communicated. I'm afraid you're going to have to talk to other people about that. But I hope I've given my interpretation and my views upon, you know, upon the broader relationships.
Thanks, Tony. I mean, personally, I'm not sure about spaghetti. I think it's a Gordian knot, and like Alexander, I'd simply just cut it.
But
thank you very much.
Another view would be that it's an amazing English quirk, and we're very good at quirks in England. But I acknowledge, you know, it's unique to England. It doesn't happen anywhere else, and it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the particular, including political, the particular circumstances of 1813. Certainly, it would not be what we would do today.
Lovely, thank you, Matthew. We've got a few more questions to run through, Tony. Before I do that, if I could just announce, brethren, for those who don't know, we have got a YouTube channel. So please do make sure you subscribe to it. It's free to subscribe to. And we also have a mailing list. I will put the details on the chat group now. On the mailing list, you will be asked for your particular degrees and orders that you're part of. And as part of being on that mailing list, you will receive future invitations to Masonic events based on those talks with the degrees in mind. Thank you. Could we next please go to Ted in America, please? Brother Ted, are you still on?
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now. Perfect.
Yes, I'm glad you brought up the YouTube document. And perhaps in response to Matthew's previous question to Tony and Tony's historical documentation that was very much appreciated. In the States, at least in the New York jurisdiction, the Mark Mason is part of the Royal Arch. And how does that affect the amity between the chapters, or between well, just between the chapters and the Mark Mason? Because in the chart for the YouTube, it asks if I'm a Mark Master Mason, and indeed I am in my jurisdiction. Is that the same with, would it be the same with the United Glen Lodge jurisdiction?
Ted, thank you for the question. Grand Lodges operate a system of recognition, a mutual system of recognition, and within that, they identify which component parts of their degrees are recognized. For example, the Swedish Rite has been mapped onto degrees under the English system, and indeed under the York Rite system in your country. So that a person who's taken their degrees in the Swedish Rite knows which degrees or which ceremonies rather he can attend in England and Wales or in the York Rite and so forth. So there is a mapping system. And of course, between Supreme Grand Chapters, there is the same system of mutual recognition. So between, and although there are quite significant differences between the ceremonies themselves, the Irish Royal Arch ceremony, for example, is very different to the English one. So that system of mutual recognition is what governs what people may attend. But the fact that you are a Mark Mason who took that as a qualifying degree under your Supreme Grand Chapter is most closely resembles the system that we have under the Grand Lodge of Scotland and the Grand Lodge of Ireland, and their respective Supreme Grand Chapters. So yes, you would be able to intervisit, and you would be recognised as a Mark Master Mason, able to visit a lodge under the Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons.
Because when a member comes, a brother comes to the States and wishes to attend the Royal Arch, if he is not a virtual Master Mason, he has to first take the virtual Master Mason degree before he would be accepted to sit into a Royal Arch chapter.
But that is a regulation enacted by the Grand Lodge in the United States. It's not Correct. The regulation enacted by here. So what you are, or rather what your Grand Lodge, what your jurisdiction defines as what is acceptable to it, might be quite different from what another jurisdiction would accept. But certainly so we in the UK, we in England and Wales rather, would accept, if you've been advanced as a Mark Master Mason under your Supreme Grand Chapter as a qualifying degree to the Royal Arch, then my understanding is that the Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons here would accept that. I would have to look at the specific
ritual.
No, it's not the ritual. It's the accord between them. It's the instrument that actually recognises them. But as a principle, I can say that it would be recognised.
Thank you so much.
Good question. Thank you, Ted.
And thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Ted, as always. Brother, we'll take another 2 questions. I'm afraid time's actually running out on us. Could we please next go to Alan Silvestre?
Good evening. Thank you, Tony, by your presentation. And I'd like to ask you, when you mentioned about the 3rd degree and the relation with Noah, we've heard and we know that in the manuscript of William Watson and Cook, it's described a little bit about the Noah legend and something related to that. And then after that, in the manuscript of Graham, we have also the mention. Do you ever think that it's a possibility that the mystery plays during the medieval era could help or could influentiate it in the 3rd degree, to use the Noah legend, but for probably because of the exposure of the preacher, the change in the degree happened? And if there is any other place that you have already seen relation with the Noah legend?
Thank you for the question, Alan. I probably can't add very much to what I said earlier. We'd have to look at Desaguliers and we'd have to look at his notes. And but certainly the central premise, the mystery plays. There's a lot of evidence that the mystery plays had a big influence over the development of Masonic ritual. It was part, of course, of the oral tradition. And so these stories are just as in the same way that Aesop's fables, you see a lot of reference to Aesop's fables in various stories, and certainly at Roslin Chapel. So these various threads are often picked up and combined. And I will just make one reference, which I perhaps should have picked up earlier. In Anderson's Constitution, 1723, he refers to Noah Kedai. And some people have suggested that, or have used this to suggest that he was alluding to the Royal Art Mariner degree. Well, there's no evidence that that was around at that point. It didn't arise until much later. But Noah Kedai would be a reference to the people who were developing the third degree because of their incorporation of aspects of, or overlaying of aspects of the story of Noah into this new degree. They were looking at elements to bring together. There are other elements that come from, that were strongly influenced by Milton's Paradise Lost, for example, that have arrived into the third degree. So I think there are lots of different streams that converged into the development of that new degree. And those people, I mean, more recently, there have been others who've been involved in developing ceremonial and degrees and ritual. And we've heard about some of those more recent ones from Ian a week or two ago. So yes, I'm convinced that different elements would have been combined and would have been used in the way that you're suggesting. The specific ones and how they were used, I'd want to go back to primary sources, and you know, I don't have those available at the moment. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. We're going to go to our final question. Could I please ask Gareth Margit to come to the mic?
Thank you very much. I think this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm a relative newcomer to both craft and to chapter. When I was ready to move into chapter, it was suggested I attend a different hall just to widen my fraternal knowledge, people I know, people I interact with, etc. I got the impression from what you were saying earlier that people were encouraged to move directly from the correlated craft lodge into the matching chapter. Did I get you right?
Thank you very much, Gareth. Not quite. No. What I was referring to was that the arrangement that was part of the union of the two Grand Lodges in 1813. Part of the arrangement that the ancients and moderns came to was that the Royal Arch would be conferred in separate units, partly because of the influence of the Unlawful Societies Act of 1799, which required that no additional units be created at the time. It was agreed that one way to help incorporate the Royal Arch, but under separate membership units, would be for them to be attached to lodges. So in England and Wales, every Royal Arch chapter is attached to a lodge and takes its name, if not its number. Now, the relationship between that lodge and chapter varies extensively. Some lodges and chapters have a very close relationship. Others have a very tenuous relationship. There's no constitutional reason, and there was no intention back then, there's no constitutional reason why an individual has to or should be encouraged necessarily to join the chapter that is attached to his lodge. Nor is it necessarily the case that a chapter meets at the same place as the lodge. There are many examples of lodge and chapter bearing the same number, literally being attached, but meeting in completely different places. So the concept of being attached is consequential of the circumstances around the union and the development of Supreme Grand Chapter, which took place 4 years after the union, actually, rather than current circumstances and what you might be encouraged to do by the people who are encouraging and mentoring you. What you're experiencing is an example of how people take particular views and encourage other people to follow what they think is right. And there's nothing wrong in that. That's how we, listen to the wisdom of people with more experience. But equally, there are other views around that as well. So what I would encourage you to do is think about your options and consider what's in your best interest and what helps you develop and learn and progress and increase your understanding of Freemasonry. So thank you, Gareth. I hope that helps.
Good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Tony, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to go for one more. I've had one of the brothers who's been waiting since 4:30 to ask his question, I think. Before the lecture tour spoke, and I don't want him to be upset with me.
Okay.
Giovanni.
Is this
Thank
Giovanni
you.
from Sicily?
Yeah, thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, Tony, for a brilliant presentation. I'm looking forward to part 2. My question is very simple. On the slide before, you show a picture of the mark, and I believe there was a man and a woman on the actual picture. Am I correct?
No. If I just share my screen on that particular slide.
Yeah.
No. Oops. If I just.
That
Yeah,
looks
can you
like
see
a
that?
woman on the left.
No, if you notice, these are breeches. You're looking at the
Okay.
haircut.
Yeah.
Perhaps the body shape, I don't know. I don't think it's intended to be a woman. Now,
Sorry.
what I should, if I had ever bothered to learn the presentation of the Keystone Jewel, I might remember the description of that character. But what you have is a working mason carrying a keystone, and you have on the other side, on the coat of arms, you have somebody obviously carrying an axe. And those familiar with the ceremony of or the ritual of the degree of Master Mason would understand those two characters.
Yeah.
But I don't interpret that as a woman, no.
No, what put me off in a way was the apron, you know, like she's got, or he's got like a woman apron, if you know what I mean. Like
well, working aprons, as employed within the
in the mark,
are full-length aprons.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, that was just my impression.
That's okay, Giovanni. Every question's a good question.
Thank you
if it
very
helps
much.
If it helps you understand, then I've done my job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Giovanni. Giovanni, I think it's just more akin to us good-looking Masons nowadays. That's what it is.
I'm just reaching to my ritual here. I don't have the installation ritual, but I'll see if I can find a reference. There may be somebody more astute and learned than me who can bring that part of ritual quickly to mind, but there we go. Giovanni, if you'd like to email me, I will come back with a description of that character.
Thanks very much.
Lovely, thank you. Tony, on behalf of everybody that has been on the call, thank you very much for your time. It's been a fantastic presentation, and you and I and Mahir will be sitting down to discuss part 2. I'm quite certain of that.
Wonderful.
I think everybody's enjoyed it. I hope everybody has. Just to let you know, we have got the Grand Master, most illustrious companion, Keswick Jones of the Royal and Select Masters on next week for an insight into the cryptic degrees. So same time, same place. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you, brethren. Wish you all a very, very good night. And thank you again for your support. Many thanks, Tony.
Thank you for a very good night.
Yeah, mate. Coming back on that, I've just had a quick Google, and it does say that of the two figures, the one on the left is a workman from the quarries.
Correct.
That's right.
That's right.
Brethren, just a reminder before you leave, we will be changing our password to join this meeting room. So you will have a new password which will be published on our Facebook page from tomorrow. You will be able, you need a new PIN number in order to join the meeting rooms.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you, and good night, everybody.
What was
Good
the
night.
answer to your
Good
quiz?
day.
From Warsaw, bye. Thank you.
See you guys next time. Your quiz, mate.
Ciao.
Thank you, brethren. How many languages?
Good
I mean, sorry, yes. Oh my goodness, I forgot to say. So there are 2 winners. We've got Sean Connell and Chuck Russett. The answer, Tony, how many languages can you speak?
Sadly, only one. It's one of my 3 regrets that I never learned another language.
Which language is that?
we call it English, Ted.
Brilliant. Well, I bid you all a very, very good night.
And we'll leave the other two regrets to another occasion.
Good night, all.
Good
Thank you, Tony.
Good night.